Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I will say right off the bat, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage in not actually being able to see the slide, but presumably my hard copy will suffice. Again, welcome, and here I'll try to give a brief overview of the budget proposal that has gone to the Congress. Okay, thank you. This work? There we go. Just to start off, showing here how, just in the past 9 months, the President has made a number of policy statements, putting forward priorities that address quite directly key mission responsibilities and focus areas for the Department of Energy. Just kind of in reminding you, first there's a quote in terms of last June, putting forward the Climate Action Plan, which is clearly one that has very, very strong influence and responsibilities for us going forward here at the Department of Energy, and then more recently in the State of the Union, emphasizing the commitment to this all-of-the-above energy strategy and how it is working. It has brought us closer to energy independence, even as we have reached CO2 emissions that are essentially as low as they have been in 2 decades. So it's a commitment to climate, and it's still a commitment to this all-the-above energy approach. Secondly, next in that list is some excerpts from his speech in Berlin, also last June, emphasizing, again, 2 areas that are, of course, central to what we do. One, maintaining a strong deterrent, maintaining reliability and safety of our nuclear stockpile as long as we have nuclear weapons, and committing very strongly to the President's agenda, really initially put forward in Prague in 2009, very early in his administration, to look at securing and, when possible, eliminating nuclear weapons usable materials around the world. And finally, in July last year as well, the President committed to a management agenda and directed the Cabinet to really place an emphasis on strong management, having agencies carry out their missions for the American people in ways that are good at delivering services that are effective and efficient. And as we will discuss, we have organized, in fact, the department, reorganized the department, I'll come back to this a bit later on, along these very 3 lines. I want to introduce now here, sitting up here in front, the people who are heading these 3 lines of business. I will say that many of you know we have 10 nominees waiting for confirmation, but in the meantime, I have to say we have a terrific team who are running these various organizations. Mike Notek is the Deputy Undersecretary for Energy and Science. So I would say it now, what we did is we merged what used to be 2 different undersecretary roles. We believe having energy and science together is much more effective, and I'll demonstrate that a little bit later on in terms of some of the cross-cutting initiatives we have, and also in terms of what we're trying to do, for example, in re-examining and strengthening the way we work with our national laboratories. David Klaus is the Deputy Undersecretary for Management and Performance. This is the, if you like, new undersecretary slot, and is emphasizing that directive of the President's to really have a very, very strong focus on management. We'll discuss this a little bit later on, but we all know that there have been a lot of successes in terms of what we do in terms of major projects. We also have had some obviously some challenges, and I'll come back and touch upon those. A focus on management performance from the project aspects to the way we manage our, what you might call backroom functions, is absolutely critical. On my left here, Bruce Held is the acting administrator of the National Nuclear Security Agency, NNSA, and an undersecretary for nuclear security. Bruce has been in this role since, I guess, July of last year. I'm also going to just not introduce all of them, but here we have in many of the seats here the heads of the program, of various program elements, and during the question period, we will feel quite free to call upon not only the people here, but also those who head the various programs. I also want to particularly introduce and single out Allison Doon and Chris Johns back there, who Allison is our acting CFO, and with Chris, they have done a tremendous amount of hard work putting these budgets together over these last months. So, thank you for that. Okay, so as I said, these areas line up with the President's priorities, and we've made them line up with our organization as well. So now to, yeah, I can see that's right. So let me say a little bit first about high level kind of budget for the department as a whole, and then we will go into each of those three areas, not in a comprehensive discussion of all those budgets. You'll have the chance to read the document in great detail eventually, but at least to point out some of the noteworthy areas that I'd like to emphasize. First point is that the top line budget request is $27.9 billion. This is a 2.6% increase above the FY14 enacted level. And of course, I note that the FY15 budget in the budget agreement, the congressional budget agreement, is essentially flat. So 2.6% we think is actually a strong vote of confidence by the President, and one that, again, because it aligns with those priorities, particularly around clean energy, climate, and nuclear security. Now, the President, I think as you know, also said that while the budget submission meets the congressional budget cap, that the view is that we really should be investing more than that in key priorities, and consequently, in addition to the budget submission, which includes the $27.9 billion for the Department of Energy, there is an additional Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative, which the President has put forward, fully paid for. So the argument is that with a variety of approaches, including addressing tax loopholes, et cetera, that this could be an increment to the budget cap that would accomplish additional priorities and would be fully offset. For the Department of Energy, there's various ways of breaking it out, but here, as you see, there's about $1.6 billion in that additional initiative, with just over $1 billion in the energy climate arena. As you can see there, $355 for climate resilience and $684 for other energy initiatives. We'll come back to that in a bit. And so roughly $1 billion for energy and roughly $600 million for nuclear security. Not on here, I'll mention this and come back later as well. In addition, there's an energy security trust fund on the mandatory side at $200 million per year for 10 years. And as we'll see, that has a focus on advanced transportation vehicles and fuels. So that's another piece that the Department of Energy would be, well, obviously heavily engaged in. If we look still at this kind of very high level, kind of macro budget, this is just a pie chart that again focuses on these three areas: energy and science, nuclear security, management and performance. You can see these budgets here, 9.8 billion, 11.9, et cetera, billion, are not exactly the budgets managed by the undersecretaries, but let's just say very, very close. So it gives you an idea as well as to how in this organization the financial resources are distributed, how the responsibilities are distributed for spending those funds, assuming, of course, that the Congress appropriates them in this way. But as you can see, energy and science, roughly 10 billion, nuclear security, roughly 12. and management performance, roughly 6. So now what I'll do is I'll now just say in a little more detail what some of the elements are of these various lines, directorates, if you wish, we could call them. So first, I'll start with the energy and science, the $9.8 billion request that we had on that pie chart. Here, I don't want to read all of these, but as you can see, in this in the energy line, first of all, of course, we have our applied energy programs, but of course, we also have ARPA-E, and we shouldn't forget about Energy Information Administration, our new energy policy systems analysis, international affairs, has a security role, but probably even more so an energy role, our loan programs, and our PMAs. So I just want to emphasize the diversity of programs and responsibilities that we have in the energy sector. And then, of course, the Office of Science, we could have broken out all the sub-offices, but in at just over $5 billion. This is where, again, you see in these two other boxes the additional requests, one for the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative, and one for the mandatory funding side, the Energy Security Trust Fund. And again, I'll come back to these. I should say that, again, the Energy Security Trust Fund the proposal is for $200 million for 10 years, paid for out of royalties on the mandatory side. So now, actually this I think we've already said, in energy and science, we're obviously talking climate action plan, we're talking all the above energy, and we're talking about promoting and sustaining U.S. leadership in science and technology innovation. But let me move to the next slide and I'll say a little bit more about some of the programs and some of the crosscuts. So first of all, EERE, energy efficiency and renewable energy. There are, of course, as you know, it's a large program. The budget of $2.3 billion, I believe it is. I don't have it right in front of me, but Dave, it's 2.3, right? 2.3 billion, which would be about a 24% increase. Spans sustainable transportation, renewables, manufacturing and efficiency. A few things to point out. As many of you know, when I started my tenure in this position, I made a very, very strong emphasis about energy efficiency as a focus area. And as you can see in this budget, when we add up the various pieces of energy efficiency, we are proposing a 39% increase. So very, very strong focus, whether it's buildings and transportation, in the new manufacturing initiatives, industry energy efficiency across the board. This is a very, very strong focus. And obviously, that's complemented by other activities such as the weatherization program, such as the accelerated pace that we have had in issuing new energy efficiency standards as examples. So again, we have our strong technology development programs, but many other responsibilities as well for promoting, in this case, energy efficiency. Now, advanced manufacturing has gotten a lot of attention, and you heard the President in the State of the Union talk about what he wanted to do there, including, by the way, in the supplementary initiative, if you like, having a strong focus on creating more of the advanced manufacturing institutes. We announced one following the President's announcement last week, I think it was, last week or 2 weeks ago, I forget. There were 2 DoD awards, a new one on advanced composites for the Department of Energy. The FY15 budget submission, we will want to go ahead with at least one more of those institutes funded essentially at $70 million over 5 years, with at least a 1-to-1 matching from the proposers and their states. On renewables, obviously we will continue. So this is, again, we have a very continuing program in solar, for example, with Sunshot, et cetera. But this is just emphasizing, again, some of the newer things as we intend to go ahead with our three offshore wind projects to get that kicked off, a new geothermal program, and also just to say that we will be implementing given the success of the request for the Defense Production Act action to allow us to move forward on our DOD, DOE, USDA advanced biofuels project. Vehicles, again, will be a major focus, and let me just say, in the Energy Security Trust Fund now, the one that I've mentioned now a couple of times, that will be specifically for advanced transportation infrastructure and R&D focused on reducing oil dependence in the transportation sector. So that's some of the issues, some of the highlights or noteworthy areas in the EERE budget. If I turn to fossil energy, we will, of course, continue to have strong focus on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Now, I'll be straightforward. Compared to the FY14 budget that was implemented by the Congress, there is a reduction in FE overall, not with respect to last year's request. We think it's a strong program. But here we want to emphasize that in addition to the work that will be directly funded out of FE in the FY15 request in terms of new capture systems, for example, storage, CO2 storage infrastructure, et cetera, do want to remind one that the program continues to execute on the $6 billion committed to the large-scale CCUS demonstration projects. And in addition, we have the up to $8 billion loan guarantee program focused on fossil fuels that reduce CO2 emissions. So again, this is a major program in coal and fossil fuels more generally. As an aside, on the loan program, just note that just in the last few weeks, we celebrated the opening of the Ivanpah, world's largest solar thermal plant in California, and closed the loan on the Vogtle nuclear reactors. We have this fossil fuel program, and we will be expecting to do more with the loan program going forward, very much reflecting all of the above energy approach that we have been talking about. I'll just mention a few things in natural gas that we will be, it's not a huge program, but we'll be substantially raising the level of play on things like gas hydrates. A lot of international interest, a lot of desire to collaborate with us on that. This is the kind of thing that we can maybe dream about, that perhaps this is the kind of start that we had 30 years ago in the first work that led to the unconventional gas developments that we have now seen mature so dramatically in the last 5 or 6 years. We don't know, but we want to start that work in terms of the experiments and the understandings about gas hydrates. We will continue and, in fact, emphasize an interagency R&D collaboration on shale gas, largely a focus on the environmental performance in terms of production. And also, for the first time, we are proposing to move to a demonstration of natural gas CCS, because certainly if we look decades ahead for natural gas, as with coal, to be a major player in a very low carbon world will require CCS technology here as well. I'll just mention a couple of other things which are not in the budget but of relevance to this whole agenda. For example, with the National Petroleum Council, we have them, and I think they are very enthusiastically beginning to look at fuels resilience issues. With SEAB, the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, I expect a report at the end of March, their next meeting, on frac focus, so dealing with the issue of what's in fracking fluid, et cetera. So just again want to emphasize that in addition to the technology programs, lots of things going on here connecting to the current situation with hydrocarbons. Nuclear energy the budget is roughly flat from the 14 appropriated amount. What I would say is two of the real focus areas. One is continuing a focus on kind of next generation nuclear reactors, continuing the technical support for the two awards made for SMRs, for example, but also funding the continuation of the very first DOE hub, the one at Oak Ridge on modeling and simulation of nuclear systems, one that we feel has been, obviously, since we are proposing to continue it, has been extremely successful. But in addition, really a focus on developing more of the technology and the processes that we need to advance long-term nuclear waste management approaches, the approach largely based around the Blue Ribbon Commission report, and then subsequently the administration's nuclear waste strategy going ahead. The Office of Electricity has a substantial increase, over 20% in the proposal, and this is an emphasis really on two areas, I would say, broadly speaking. One is the grid of the future, including a strong focus on resilience. I'll come back to this because while the Office of Electricity in many ways leads this, it actually involves a number of other programs in a cross-cut that we are putting forward for this year. And that will include, as noted here, things like microgrids and grid-scale energy storage. But it also involves our growing focus on emergency response. We have seen lots of issues over this last winter with extreme weather. Of course, we saw it with Sandy going back to 2012. But obviously, we are also concerned about cyber attacks. Just today in the Wall Street Journal was the second installment on the issue of physical security of the grid and substations and transformers. So again, I'm not covering everything, but grid of the future, as we'll see, cross-cutting many offices, big piece in OE, and this issue of emergency response will be key focus areas for us to be growing in FY15 and beyond. The request includes a request for funds for, in fact, a resilience operations center. Just a few other energy points to make. Our ARPA-E continues to, we believe, to be very successful, and we're asking for a 16% increase there, which will include a substantial piece for what we call an open solicitation, just looking for the best ideas coming in from anywhere, anytime, roughly speaking, and I'm sure finding some real gems in there. EIA, Energy Information Administration, I really want to emphasize how important that is to what the department does, but it's also how important it is to the energy markets. And so we're again asking for an increase there, in particular to do things like upgrade their energy infrastructure, but also to develop the new products for the evolving markets. An example of this last year, for example, was well productivity as a new tool, and so the EIA will certainly, we hope, be moving forward with some new products. EPSA, I mentioned Energy Policy and Systems Analysis. Now, this was the office set up over this last year with a major responsibility as Executive Secretariat for the Quadrennial Energy Review. There's also a significant increase in here. The increase is once again focused on this grid modernization program. So this will be a lot of the analytics and modeling around that, just another piece of what I mentioned in the context of the Office of Electricity as a broader departmental grid program. And we also have consolidated our tribal energy programs and are proposing an expansion of funding. And finally, for energy and science, well, no, that's not true. I'll do cross-cuts as well. The science request has, of course, a number of features. I'll mention a few. One revolves around the historic, I think, strength and responsibility of the department in the development of large-scale computational capability. Of course, at NSA, the defense programs has also played a major role in that over the years. The Office of Science is now playing an increasingly important role, I would say, in developing the tools, but of course has played an important role for a long time in terms of the applications to many science grand challenges like climate modeling, like computational material science. And in particular, science will lead, with NNSA also heavily engaged, really an increased focus on reaching the exascale. And I always want to emphasize that it's not so much hitting exascale on the button that's important. It's the path to exascale will be tremendously productive and will keep, I think, this country in a very important leadership role in terms of the application of those tools to science, to defense, and to industry. There will clearly be an ongoing commitment to the leading edge facilities that Office of Science funds. Just to mention two going forward out of many, the heavy ion accelerator at Michigan State. In fact, I think is being dedicated on the 17th, I believe it is. Pat, correct? And then I mentioned also here the coherent light source phase 2, just examples again of, I think you all know, is this unparalleled set of cutting-edge research tools that serve 29,000 users annually. Sustained commitment to energy frontier research centers, and I might say as an aside again, with CIAB, we are taking a look at how we can, A, evaluate, but B, move on to improve hubs, EFRCs, bioenergy centers, EFRCs, ARPA-E, EFRCs, we feel have been a tremendous success, and that's why we are moving forward again with a strong program. The fusion bullet I will not read because I am recused from fusion, but someone else will answer anything on that issue. And finally, in energy and science, cross-cutting initiatives, I've said several times that we've tried to put an emphasis now on a set of areas, mostly in energy and science, but also involving NNSA in several places that have multiple office engagement. I mentioned the grid, for which I've already mentioned the Office of Electricity and EPSA, but EERE has a strong role, and actually our intergovernmental office will have a role as well, because of course a lot of this ends up with the states. Subsurface science and engineering, I won't go through all of it, but just to when you think about it, so much of what we do in the energy business involves subsurface science and engineering, whether it's CO2 sequestration, unconventional production, nuclear waste, geothermal, we can go on and on. So we're bringing together what have been a set of disparate programs in trying to get some coherence and value added. I mentioned exascale already. Supercritical CO2 is another one that spans 3 offices, looking for what could be an extremely interesting high-efficiency technology for multiple thermal plants. And cybersecurity, although I think here there's a mistake. I think it says EM. I think it should have said Office of Electricity. So we'll have to correct that. Dave, are you doing cybersecurity particularly? I don't think so. But your neighbor is. Right. So this is, but NNSA, the CIO, the Chief Information Officer, Office of Electricity, and Science, all engaged in that. So that we think is exciting, frankly, and we're giving a much stronger emphasis to working across our programs to add value. Okay, let me shift to nuclear security. $11.9 billion. This is plus 4%, and again you see both the budget within the cap and the contribution from the additional initiative. Let me focus first on the weapons activities. Here, I mean, we should always start out by reminding ourselves that when all is said and done, our key responsibility here is, in fact, to certify a safe and reliable stockpile without testing, again, as long as we have nuclear weapons. And we all know that there's a major challenge here. The interagency process, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, National Security Council, OMB, first of all, I believe that process has worked very well this year to come together and affirm that we must commit, even if it involves a little stretching out here or there, but we must commit to the so-called 3+2 strategy as a way to continue a safe and reliable stockpile while reducing the numbers and types of weapons as we go forward in what is really going to be like a 20-year journey from where we are. This budget is up. It's a 7% increase. That was not easily come by in these constrained cap times, because you all know as well, the Department of Defense with their strained budgets, but it was unanimous that we had to make this investment in order to stick to this program in all of its areas, the life extension programs, the rebuilding of infrastructure, the continuation of the science and engineering base that we will need for certification in the long term. So that's what we're doing there, and it's a major commitment, and it will include finishing the life extension of the W-76 and moving forward on schedule, or essentially on schedule, for the B-61 and the W-88 370, which will sustain the triad as our core nuclear deterrent posture. Naval reactors has also been building up a set of major needs in terms of nuclear propulsion. We all know the critical role that nuclear propulsion plays in the Navy, both submarines and aircraft carriers. And again, this is a significant request, and I might say the Department of Defense stepped in here and made this a high priority. Nuclear nonproliferation, I'm afraid, is not such a great story, to be honest. It's frankly disappointing. We have a substantial reduction this year, but this was what happens with the capped budget and the very tough choices that we had to make. However, I do want to emphasize that we believe this will continue to be a very robust program. It's a program that's had a lot of success over these last years, following the Prague agenda. 11 countries plus Taiwan eliminating all the HEU and or plutonium. We will continue to be doing that in FY15. We will continue to be working on things like conversion of research reactors. And I should emphasize, there are various things here that you can look at, but should emphasize that more than half of this reduction is from our response to the considerable cost increase of the MOX project. I'm not going to duck it. I mean, you all know it's a huge project. From what we can see now with the current approach, we're talking about a $30 billion plus life cycle budget across all the components of what it takes to do MOX, to dispose of the 34 tons. We remain completely committed to the disposal of those 34 tons of weapons plutonium. But with this budget, we are going into a standby mode, and we are looking at options, which includes the question of, is there a way to get a substantial cost reduction in the MOX approach? So again, in this 20% drop, over half of that is from the MOX program. Nevertheless, I mean, I really wish we could have found more resources for the other parts, the critical other parts of the program in terms of nuclear materials, security, and elimination. But again, we will make this still a robust program in FY15. And finally, if I turn to the management performance line, as I said, I think I said earlier, we moved environmental management from an affiliate of NNSA into a mainline responsibility for the Undersecretary for Management and Performance, as well as a lot of the other functions you see here, like CFO and Human Capital Officer, CIO, et cetera. This is not strictly speaking for that Undersecretary line, but again, I won't go through it again. We did how we reorganized the undersecretaries. We established the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Group. But I will also say that we have partly achieved, particularly on the security side, and we are in the middle of reorganizing the entire health, safety, and security functions with a major responsibility for the Undersecretary Management Performance, although with an independent assessment capability continuing to reside in the Office of the Secretary. And so that reorganization will continue to, we think, better align our responsibilities and authorities. And of course, we will be supporting diversity, small businesses, and Native Americans. I mentioned earlier the consolidation of the Indian energy programs. Initiatives going on. We are working, these are not budgetary issues as such, but strong emphasis on rebuilding the strategic partnership with the national laboratories. We are doing things like looking at efficiencies, cost reductions in human resources and IT services, and we have strengthened management of cyber and incident management control. I should have also added on here, and I forgot, last summer we formed a project management group that has bringing together project management experience across the entire department, looking for best practices and seeing how we can institutionalize more effective enterprise-wide project management. EM specifically in 2015, obviously continuing the cleanup at 16 sites, but I really want to also single out that, as many of you know, we are in the process of negotiating a new framework for the Hanford Waste Treatment Plant, which we believe will be a very effective approach to vitrifying the Hanford tank waste. We have still ongoing challenges at Oak Ridge and Portsmouth and now Paducah. We have to think about eventually moving to D&D there. And we will be continuing to make, we think, excellent progress at Savannah River and Idaho as well. So that's basically what I wanted to say. And so now back to the beginning. This is our charge from the President, basically. We have a lot to do, and this FY15 budget proposal will allow us to make very substantial progress on all of those priorities. And so with that, thank you for your attention, and we're going to open up for questions. And again, I will probably manage the questions more than answer them. So, please. Aoife, how are we doing this? We just... Free-for-all. It's a free-for-all. Okay. Who wants to be the first free-for-all?
Yeah, Mr. Secretary. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Jim Ostroff with Platts. Let me just ask, it's not clear here. 2 quick points. What is the proposed FY15 budget for the MOX program? And secondly, has a decision been made to go another way, or is there a possibility that that MOX facility could continue on and be completed?
So I believe correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but I believe it's $216 million. Is that correct?
For MOX?
For MOX. Oh, I'm sorry. Ann, yeah, thank you.
For S&D overall is
Yes.
$311 million, with 221 of that going to the MOX facility to put it into
221.
cold standby.
Right, 221, thank you. Yeah, yeah. And as I said earlier, we have a task force that's been working at this very hard for the last 9 months. They are continuing to work with the contractors to see if we can't find some other way of doing this to get a substantial cost reduction on the MOX path, but we are continuing to look at other pathways as well. And that involves, in addition, of course, international discussions in terms of that. But again, I want to emphasize, we are committed to disposition of those 34 tons of plutonium. Yeah, two back there, whichever.
I'm Umair Irfan with ClimateWire. Mr. Secretary, in the budget request, it says that the department will achieve savings through cutting low priority and low performing programs. Other than MOX, do you have any other examples of that?
Well, I think if you look at the budget overall, as I said, we have a 2.6% increase. We have programs that have gone up very, very substantially. I mentioned efficiency, 39%, for example. So clearly, there are going to be haircuts taken elsewhere. And I will leave that for the assistant secretaries to discuss in terms of their own programs. Actually, if anybody I think you'll do it later in the next session, right? Okay.
Darius Dixon with Politico. With the Energy Security Trust idea, I mean, last year it kind of died in Congress, and is the idea to still not do new exploration? Because I think that's what Republicans have been wanting, and I think the White House had conveyed last year that the trust would not be pulling these funds from new exploration, and somehow I don't know how the accounting will work out with that. Is that still the plan?
Well, yeah, you're certainly correct that the proposal to Congress is to apply it to the technologies that fundamentally address oil dependence, specifically in the vehicle and fuels infrastructure areas. I suppose there can be a dialogue.
Thanks. Hi, Mr. Secretary. Jim Snyder with Bloomberg News. In the budget document, and you mentioned it briefly as well, there's $355 million for climate resilience. Can you talk a little bit more about what that would fund?
Yeah, a major part of that in the initiative fund, you mean, right? Yeah. A major part of that will be, first of all, an expansion of the grid work with a specific focus on resilience. In fact, I should note that I think many of you know this, but just to make sure, the Quadrennial Energy Review being carried out in 2014 has a focus specifically on energy infrastructure, and resilience is a key part of that effort. So resilience is going to be a major theme, and I will call on Pat. You want to elaborate on that? I want to get others involved.
So partly what's going to happen is we're going to look at energy assurance planning, look at some planning activities with respect to how do we support energy assurance in the United States. You can look at the fuel disruption issues that have occurred. The other aspect is looking at deployment of technology such as microgrids, which the Secretary already had mentioned.
And in addition, it will be looking at, in terms, in addition to the grid, at fuels resilience. Again, you know that we've obviously had major issues in the last year in a number of ways, whether it's getting gas to certain regions as bottlenecks, whether it's the recent propane issues, bottlenecks in terms of perhaps moving oil out of some of the new regions, Hurricane Sandy. So and the interplay of electricity and fuels. So that will all be a focus, certainly in the QER and in Pat's office, Office of Electricity, and in the Energy Policy and Systems Analysis Office.
Darius Dixon with Politico. You mentioned the suite of the 10 nominees that the department still has sitting in the Senate. I guess, have you had any understanding of what kind of progress might be made on them, timelines, or
Uh,
aspirational goals?
No, aspiration goal is easy, but look, it's obviously very, very, very frustrating, you know, I mean, but we all know that the confirmation process is kind of slow to a crawl at the moment, and all I can do is hope that we'll have our full complement, our full team together soon.
I think we've got time for one last question. So,
Hannah Northey with E&E Publishing. Is it $39 million? Is that all that's going for QER, or is there more money for the QER, and where's that coming from?
Oh, no, it's actually less than that.
It's actually less
Yeah,
than
that includes significant funding. I think it's, somebody remind me, I think it's 12 million, for example, for the grid part of what EPSA is doing, the grid program, a grid modernization program. No, so the EPSA, the core EPSA team that's been built up, and which has drawn people from other parts of the department, EERE, for example, CFO, other offices, OE, have come together. It's about 60 people, and they are the core team that will be doing the quadrennial energy review and other activities as well, like this grid modernization program. But of course, I want to emphasize that that's our executive secretariat. Now, clearly, there are many people across the administration involved, because the whole idea is that it is a administration-wide effort coordinated out of the Executive Office of the President. Okay, you got permission, I see.
Thank you.
Right.
Again, Jim
No, thank you.
Ostroff with, thank you. I appreciate it.
Right.
Just quick follow-up here. With respect to MOX, you mentioned that the United States, among the issues, may be considering doing something with international partners. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that? And finally, how much money for SMR research?
Well, no, the international reference, of course, refers to the fact that we have an agreement with Russia to both dispose of 34 metric tons. And at the right time, we will have to re-engage in those discussions. Now may not be the right time. Oh, SMR funding, well, again, as I said, it's to continue, again, actually, well, Pete, why don't you talk about that? Yeah,
On the licensing technical support, there's 97 million, which is intended to fully fund the continuation of the two agreements. And of course, one agreement is still in negotiation. In addition, the Advanced Reactor Technology Program, which would include work relevant to SMRs, that has a total of 70 million.
But there is not a request for a new solicitation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify that, right?
Oh, I didn't, I,
okay, great. The secretary has somewhere
it.
else to be, so unless
Okay.
you have closing.
Well, no, actually, these gentlemen didn't say anything. You want to say something? You did a great job. No. Okay. All right, that's enough then.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Okay, thank you.